Before you ask me to move it, you should probably call your aunt.
Before you ask me to move it, the woman with the pink paintbrush said, you should probably call your aunt. I stopped dead in the dirt driveway, my hand still gripping the handle of my rolling suitcase, looking from the weathered log cabin I had left empty for nearly a year to the brand new, bright pink structure rising less than 30 paces away. She was wearing a white tank top and jeans, standing beside the unfinished siding, and she turned to look over her shoulder at me with a calm, amused smile that suggested she had known exactly what my face would look like at this exact moment. She just went back to painting, sliding the brush along the trim in a smooth, unbothered motion, while I pulled my phone out of my pocket, staring at the screen and trying to decide if I was supposed to be furious or if I should just politely ask when I had lost my mind. The driftless region of Wisconsin was supposed to be quiet. I owned a small restaurant in the city. For 51 weeks a year, my life was a blur of vendor shortages, broken walk-in coolers, scheduling conflicts, and the relentless hum of a dining room that seated 80 but always felt like it held 300. I closed the restaurant for one slow week at the end of October. That was my window. Brooke still held legal title to the acreage under an old family arrangement, but I had paid for the place years ago, covered the taxes, maintained the old log cabin, and treated it as mine. I drove up here to be entirely, universally unavailable. And now, there was a pink cabin in my front yard. I didn't yell. I didn't drop my bag and march over to demand she get off my land. Instead, I looked at the survey stakes with fresh neon flagging tape hammered into the soil. I looked at the neatly stacked lumber. I looked at the woman who was currently humming along to a radio playing softly from the porch of her structure. I dialed Brooke's number. My aunt picked up on the second ring. "Joshua, you're at the cabin." "I am," I said, my voice perfectly level. "And apparently, the property has learned to reproduce when left unattended." "Brooke, I was going to call you. I should have called you before I signed anything." "Brooke, why is there a pink house next to my house?" "It's on piers," she said quickly. "It's movable. I still hold the deed, so I could legally lease the clearing. On the parcel map, that half-acre looked tucked behind the tree line. I didn't realize you could see it straight from your porch until Colleen sent me a framing photo. By then, she had signed, paid the deposit, and the crew was booked. I still should have called." "You gave a stranger a ground lease 30 yards from my front door." "Yes," Brooke said quietly, "and I handled it badly." That answer was harder to argue with than an excuse. I hung up. I put the phone back in my jacket pocket. I let go of my suitcase and walked slowly across the grass, stopping about 10 feet from the pink cabin. Colleen wiped a stray drop of paint from the edge of the can. She didn't look frightened, and she didn't look apologetic. She looked like a woman who had a valid contract and a lot of work left to do before sundown. "So," I said, keeping my tone dry, "Brooke says the lease is real." Colleen nodded. "She mentioned you might be surprised. I'm Colleen Nichols." "Joshua Bass." "I know. She talks about you a lot. She said you only come up here when your restaurant forces you to take a break." She set the paintbrush across the rim of the bucket and finally turned to face me fully. "I have a legal lease, Joshua. I hired a crew to do the framing and the roof last month, and I'm finishing the exterior myself. I'm not trying to take your space, but I am allowed to be here." She didn't over-explain. She didn't beg for my understanding. She just stated the logistics of her existence and waited for me to process them. "I see that," I said. I looked at the gap between the two buildings. It wasn't a trespass. The access road was clear. The well pump was untouched. But the absolute isolation I had been banking on for 11 months was gone. "Do you need a minute?" she asked, gesturing vaguely toward my expression. "I might need several," I admitted. I walked back to my suitcase, pulled it up the wooden steps of my log cabin, and unlocked the heavy door. The air inside was stale, smelling of old pine and dust. It was exactly as I had left it. but when I looked out the front window, there was a flash of pink through the trees. The next morning, I woke up early. It was a habit I couldn't break no matter how far I drove from the city. By 6:30, I was sitting on my front porch in the cold morning air, wearing a heavy sweater, a mug of black coffee in my hand. I had dragged my old, battered, two-seat bistro table out onto the porch years ago. It was a small wrought iron thing I had salvaged from the restaurant's patio during a remodel. I only ever used one chair. The table was currently covered with my laptop, a legal pad, and my phone. I was supposed to be on vacation, but Timothy, my manager, had texted me twice about a supplier issue. I looked up from the screen. Over at the pink cabin, Colleen was already awake. She was sitting on a cooler on her unfinished porch, wearing a thick flannel shirt, holding her own mug of coffee. In her other hand, she was rapidly typing on her phone. She looked just as tense, just as wired to a distant responsibility as I was. I watched her finish typing, hit send with a sharp tap of her thumb, and then drop the phone into her pocket with a heavy exhale. She looked up, caught me watching her, and raised her coffee mug in a silent, slightly self-deprecating salute. I raised mine back. We were two strangers who had spent a lot of money to buy permission to be unavailable, and neither of us knew how to actually use it. That afternoon, before the weather turned, I caught myself watching her work again. A narrow strip of trim had bowed away from the wall, and instead of forcing it, Colleen set the brush down, measured twice, shifted 2 clamps, and worked it back into line a little at a time. She never looked toward my cabin for help. I went inside before she caught me staring. By then I understood something I hadn't on arrival. She wasn't building beside me because she needed someone nearby to rescue the project. She was building a place she intended to manage on her own. Later that afternoon, the weather forecast on my phone updated with a severe warning. A hard cold front was dropping down from Canada, bringing freezing rain and a sharp overnight drop in temperature. The wind was already starting to pick up, rattling the dry leaves in the oaks. I was inside, reviewing a revised menu draft, when I heard boots on my wooden steps. I opened the door. Colleen was standing there, the wind whipping loose strands of blonde hair across her face. She looked colder than she had an hour ago. "I have a logistical question," she said, getting straight to the point. "Shoot." "The temporary utility hookup for my site isn't active until Friday. The crew is coming back then to anchor the piers and finish the lines. Until then, I don't have running water. I usually bring jugs from town, but I miscalculated. Can I use your exterior spigot for the next 2 days?" "Yes," I said. "And," she continued, pointing back toward her site, "I have 4 boxes of interior laminate and 2 buckets of joint compound that cannot freeze or get wet. My cabin isn't fully sealed yet. The wind is blowing straight through the window rough-ins. Can I store them under the overhang of your porch?" I looked at her. She wasn't asking me to fix her house. She wasn't playing helpless. She just needed a physical surface that was protected from the rain. "You can use the spigot," I told her, "and you can put the materials on the west side of the porch. But I have rules." "Let's hear them." "You don't need to knock or ask permission every time you need water. Just take it. If my laptop is out on the table and I'm on a call, treat the west porch as a private room. Don't engage." She nodded once, completely unfazed by the boundary. "Fair enough. I have a rule too." I leaned against the doorframe. "All right. If Brooke drives up here to check on my progress, you do not let her into my cabin, and you do not give her a status report on my behalf. She's my landlord, not my mother." "Deal," I said. It was an easy concession. I didn't want to manage her life. I just wanted my perimeter respected. But by 4 o'clock, the temperature had plummeted 15 degrees. The sky turned a bruised, ugly purple, and the wind began to howl through the valley. I went out to the porch to grab my laptop. Colleen was securing a heavy plastic tarp over the window openings of her cabin, struggling against the gusts. I walked over. I didn't take the staple gun from her hand. I just held the bottom edge of the flapping plastic taut so she could secure the top. Thanks, she shouted over the wind. You can't sleep in there tonight, I said, looking at the thin walls and the gaps where the wind was already tearing at the plastic. There's no heat. She hopped down from her step stool, wiping her forehead. I know. I'm driving into Viroqua. I had a backup room booked at a motel just in case, but they called an hour ago. A pipe burst in their east wing, and they had to cancel my reservation. I'm going to try to find something else on the highway. I looked at the sky. The rain was going to start freezing the second it hit the asphalt. Driving blind on county roads looking for a vacancy was a bad idea. I have a guest room, I said. She stopped packing her tool bag and looked at me. It's small, I continued, keeping my voice entirely flat, presenting it as a logistical fact, not a rescue mission. It has a space heater, the door locks from the inside. You can stay for one night until the front passes. If you don't want to do that, I can give you the addresses of 2 places 40 minutes north that might have power. Colleen stared at me, evaluating the offer. She was looking for the catch. She was looking for the part where I expected gratitude, or a home-cooked meal, or a conversation she didn't want to have. Where is the room in relation to yours? She asked. Opposite end of the hall. We share the bathroom, but I'll stay out of it after 8. Does Brooke know you have a guest room? Brooke knows nothing about the interior of my house, and I intend to keep it that way. She looked at her freezing, tarp-covered cabin, then at the dark sky, and then at me. Okay, one night. Thank you, Joshua. Bring what you need, I said, and walked back to my cabin. An hour later, she knocked on my door. She was holding a single overnight bag. She had left the rest of her life over in her own space. Before dark, the storm hit. Freezing rain lashed against the windows, ticking and snapping against the glass in uneven bursts, while the wind pushed at the old cabin walls. I was in the kitchen, boiling water for pasta, when my phone rang. It was Timothy. I answered it, putting it on speaker as I stirred the pot. Tell me the place isn't burning down, Tim. Not burning, Timothy said, sounding stressed. But Marcus just walked out. He quit mid-shift. And Sarah called in sick. I have a fully booked dining room in an hour, and I'm down 2 line cooks. I don't know if we can push the tickets out. My chest tightened. The familiar adrenaline spike of restaurant ownership hit my bloodstream. My first instinct, the one I had operated on for 5 years, was to grab my keys. I could make it back in 3 hours if I sped. I could salvage the dinner service. I looked up. Colleen was standing in the doorway of the hallway. She had heard the exchange. She didn't say anything, but I saw the recognition in her eyes. It was the look of someone who knew exactly what that panic felt like. I looked away from her and stared at the boiling water. Tim, I said into the phone, we are not failing a service because of Marcus. Go into the system. Block all walk-ins for the rest of the night. Call the reservations for 8:30 and 9 o'clock and offer them a $50 gift card if they reschedule for next week. Cut the capacity down to what you and David can actually cook. Do not kill yourself trying to serve 80 people with a skeleton crew. Are you sure? Timothy asked. We'll lose revenue. We'll lose more if you serve raw chicken because you're in the weeds. Shrink the room. You can handle a 40-cover night. I trust you. Okay, chef. I got it. I hung up. I took a slow breath, forcing the tension out of my shoulders. Colleen walked into the kitchen. Coastal Diner, she said quietly. I turned around. What? I own a coastal diner on Lake Michigan. 80 seats, huge tourist rush in the summer. I'm closed for a short shoulder season break before the holidays. That's why I'm here now. It was my only window. So you know the drill. I know the feeling that if you don't step in, the whole building collapses, she said. She leaned against the counter. It took me 3 years to realize that if I have to rescue my staff every time someone gets a flat tire, I don't have a business. I have a hostage situation. I let out a short, harsh breath that might have been a laugh. Yeah, That's about right. I grabbed a stack of clean towels from the pantry and handed them to her. The thermostat is in the hall. Keep it at 70. Extra blankets are in the cedar chest at the foot of your bed. I didn't linger. I didn't try to turn a shared understanding of business into an excuse to stand closer to her. I went back to my pasta, and she went to her room, locking the door behind her with a solid, audible click. Later that evening, the storm broke. The rain stopped, leaving behind a biting, clear cold. I made a mug of tea and stepped out onto the front porch, zipping my jacket up to my chin. Colleen was already out there. She was sitting in the second chair at my bistro table, wrapped in one of my heavy wool blankets, holding her own mug. She didn't jump when I opened the door. She just looked over. "You didn't answer your phone earlier," she said. "Brooke called," I replied, taking the seat opposite her. "She wanted to drive over tomorrow with a casserole and meet the new neighbor. I told her the roads were iced and she needed to stay home." "Thank you." It wasn't a favor. I didn't want to eat her casserole either. She smiled, resting her chin on the rim of her mug. We sat in silence for a few minutes, looking out at the dark shapes of the trees and the faint, ghostly outline of her pink cabin. "You never asked me why pink," she said softly. "It wasn't my house." "But you hate it." I looked at the cabin, then back at her. "I think it makes the rest of the woods look severely underdressed," I said dryly. She laughed again. "But," I added, dropping the sarcasm, my voice dropping a fraction lower, "it suits you. You picked a color that makes it entirely impossible to hide, and you painted it on a house in the middle of nowhere. You did it like you didn't need anyone to approve the aesthetic." It wasn't a joke. It was a fact. And it was the first time I had looked directly at her and let her know I was paying attention to who she actually was, not just where she was parked. Colleen held my gaze. The air on the porch was freezing, but the space between us suddenly felt very still. She didn't blush or look away. "I was hoping you'd look twice," she said, her voice steady, carrying clearly over the wind. "When it's finished, and the heat is on, and the porch is sealed, I'm going to put 2 chairs out front. You'll be the first person I invite to sit in one of them." She wasn't thanking me for the guest room. She was laying down a deliberate, reciprocal invitation. She was telling me that when she finally had her own privacy, I was the one she was going to open the door for. I looked at her, recognizing that I had just stopped wanting my acreage to be empty. The next morning, the sun came out, blindingly bright off the frost. We were sitting at the bistro table on my porch. I was drinking coffee, reviewing a supply order on my laptop. She was checking her diner's payroll on her phone. At the same moment, both of our phones rang. I looked at mine, Timothy. She looked at hers, her lead server. We both answered. We both spoke in low, clipped tones, authorizing a fix, verifying a schedule, solving a problem that was 300 miles away. And then, almost in perfect sync, we both hung up and put our phones face down on the iron table. I looked at the 2 black rectangles sitting next to each other. We're closing a section that doesn't exist today, aren't we? Colleen let out a long sigh and slumped back in her chair. "I bought that cabin kit 3 years ago," she said quietly. "I saved every extra dime from the diner. I didn't want a condo. I didn't want a place near the lake where everyone knows me. I wanted a place where my first right, every single morning, was the right not to open the door. For anyone." "I get it," I said. "Do you?" She looked at me, her eyes tracing the lines of my face. "You bought this whole property. You pay for the upkeep, but you only come here when you're so burned out you can't function. This isn't your home, Joshua. It's your emergency exit." I wanted to argue, to deploy some dry, deflective comment, but I couldn't. She was right. I didn't live here. I just escaped here. "There's something Brooke didn't tell you," Colleen said, her tone shifting, becoming more careful. "The lease she gave me, it covers this clearing, but it also covers another clearing, about a half mile through the woods on the other side of the ridge. The utility crew's coming on Friday to anchor the piers and do the final hookup. Until then, the cabin can still be moved. I felt a sudden, sharp drop in my chest. Brooke offered to pay the relocation fee if I wanted to move it, Colleen continued, because she realized she screwed up by not telling you I was building right next to you. If I ask the crew on Friday morning, they'll drag it over the ridge. You'll have your absolute quiet back. You won't even be able to see my roof. The instinct to manage the situation flared up. I wanted to say, "Don't move it. I don't want you to go." I wanted to use the fact that I had just given her shelter to leverage her decision. I wanted to control the outcome. But I looked at her sitting at my table, fiercely protective of her own autonomy, and I knew that if I told her what to do, I would just be another person demanding an answer from her. "The lease is yours," I said, keeping my voice even, though it cost me everything. "You put the cabin where you want it to be, not where Brooke wants it, and not where I want it." She watched my face for a long time. Then she nodded, picking up her empty mug. "I need to go paint," she said, and walked back to her site. On Wednesday afternoon, Brooke finally showed up. She drove her SUV up the dirt road, parking near the survey stakes. She got out, carrying a large Tupperware container, looking nervously between my cabin and Colleen, who was up on a ladder, finishing the trim. I walked down the steps to meet her. "Joshua," Brooke said, handing me the container, "I brought lasagna. I see everyone survived the freeze." "We managed," I said. Brooke looked over at the pink cabin, lowering her voice. "Did she talk to you about the other clearing? The one over the ridge?" "She mentioned it." I feel terrible about this whole mix-up. I really do. I told her I'd pay the crew to skid it over there. It's much more secluded. But she said she needed to think about it. Brooke looked at me, her eyes pleading for direction. "What do you want, Joshua? It's your sanctuary. Just give the word, and I'll insist she moves it." It was the perfect out. I could reclaim my empty acreage with one sentence. I could let my aunt be the bad guy. I looked up at Colleen. She was still painting, but her shoulders were stiff. She was listening. She was waiting to see if I was going to use my family authority to override her lease. "No," I said clearly. Brooke blinked. "No?" "Her lease is valid. She's the one who has to live in it. You don't insist on anything, Brooke. You let her decide where her house goes." Brooke looked taken aback, but she nodded slowly. "All right, if you're sure." My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. "Timothy." I answered. "Tim." "Chef," Timothy said. "The city just announced a massive convention downtown this weekend. The hotels are overflowing. If you come back tomorrow, we can open up the patio, run a special menu, and easily clear an extra 10 grand over the weekend. I know you're on vacation, but..." It was the second test. The universe was handing me an excuse to run. I could go back to the restaurant, bury myself in the chaos, and not be here on Friday morning when Colleen made her decision. I wouldn't have to watch her cabin get dragged over the ridge. I could just use my business to hide. I looked at the pink cabin. I looked at the ladder. "Tim," I said, my voice rock solid. "You run the weekend. Keep the patio closed. Stick to the current capacity. I am not coming back until my week is over. But the revenue, the restaurant will survive. I'm busy." I hung up. I didn't look to see if Colleen was watching. I just took Brooke's lasagna and walked back into my cabin. By Thursday morning, Colleen's cabin was sealed. The windows were properly glazed, the heavy front door was hung, and the portable generator was running the internal baseboard heaters. She didn't need my guest room anymore. She packed her overnight bag while I was making coffee and carried it back across the grass without making a production out of it. That mattered more than I expected. The shelter part was over. Whatever happened next would not be because she needed something from me. I spent most of the day reading a book I had brought up 3 years ago and never opened. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see a crew arriving early to prepare the cabin for moving. At 4 o'clock, my phone chimed with a text. "Leave your phone on the table. Come outside." I did. Colleen was standing on her finished little porch with 2 folding camp chairs and a wooden crate between them. 2 mugs sat on the crate. I crossed the 30 paces between us. "You already looked twice," she said, pointing to the empty chair. "You might as well sit once." I sat. She handed me black coffee. "I didn't bring my phone." "Good, mine's inside." For almost an hour, neither of us talked about the lease, the crew, or Friday. Once, my phone rang faintly from my porch. I knew the tone was Timothy's. I stayed in the chair. Colleen heard it too. She looked toward my cabin, then back at the trees. She didn't congratulate me for ignoring it. That was one of the things I had started to like about her. She noticed decisions without turning them into lessons. When our coffee was gone, she stood and opened her front door. "You can see it," she said. I looked at her. "The living room," she clarified, "not the whole cabin." "Understood." I followed her inside for the first time. The space was small and simple. A narrow kitchenette ran along one wall. A second-hand armchair sat near the front window. A compact table stood under another window, with a stack of diner invoices turned face down beneath a paint catalog. A closed door led farther back. She didn't open that one. I didn't ask. "This is good," I said. Her eyes moved around the room. "It's enough." I understood what she meant. Not temporary, not borrowed. Enough because she had decided what enough was. Standing there changed the balance between us. For several days she had been the woman using my water, my porch overhang, my guest room. In here, none of that mattered. I was the guest because she had chosen to invite me. When I left, she walked me only as far as her porch. "I have some things to finish before tomorrow," she said. "Good night, Colleen." "Good night, Joshua." I crossed back to my cabin. The distance was still only 30 paces. It felt longer now that I knew exactly what I wanted on the other side of it. At 8:30, someone knocked on my door. Colleen stood outside in a dark sweater, her hands tucked into the pockets. No paintbrush, no coffee, no practical question. "Can I sit?" I stepped aside and let her onto the porch. My laptop was closed on the bistro table. I had shut it an hour earlier and, for once, had not reopened it. Colleen took the second chair. She looked toward her cabin before she looked at me. "I made the decision," she said. Every muscle in my shoulders tightened. "I'm keeping it where it is." Relief hit first, then the old instinct to hide how much relief. I ignored the instinct. "Because you want the clearing?" I asked. "Yes. And because I want you nearby." There was no joke in her voice. "The other site is quieter," she continued. "It would make more sense if the only thing I cared about was being left alone. But I kept thinking about what I told you. I wanted a place where I got to decide who came through the door." She looked at me directly. "I still want that. I just don't want the answer to be nobody." I sat very still. "But I need to know something," she said. "If you stayed quiet because you think asking me to move would make you a bad person, tell me now. I don't want to build a life around somebody tolerating me." That was the opening I had refused to manufacture all week, so I stopped hiding behind manners. "I'm not tolerating you." Her attention sharpened. "I wanted to ask you not to move the minute you told me there was another clearing," I said. "I didn't because I needed the choice to be yours. But wanting you to have the choice is not the same thing as not having an opinion." "What's your opinion?" "I want you here." The words sounded almost too simple after 4 days of thinking around them. I want the pink cabin right there where I can see it from my porch. I want you close enough to raise a coffee mug at me in the morning. And I want to see you somewhere that has nothing to do with Brooke, leases, weather, or either of our businesses. A small breath left her. "I'm asking you on a date," I said. "Tomorrow night, in town, a real one." This time she smiled. "Yes." Then she lifted one finger. "One condition." "Of course. If we do this, we don't wait until one of us is exhausted enough to run here. We pick a time before that happens." I nodded. "One weekend a month when the season allows it," she said. "We put it on the calendar. Timothy gets to be your manager. My lead gets to do the job I hired her to do. If there's a real emergency, fine. But guilt doesn't count as an emergency." A week earlier, I would have had 10 reasons ready for why my restaurant was different. "Yes," I said. "I can do that." She reached across the table and rested her hand over mine. I turned my hand beneath hers until our palms met. I gave her enough time to move away. She didn't. So I stood, and she stood with me, and I kissed her. It was brief and warm. No storm, no emergency, no debt attached to it. When I pulled back, her hand was still in mine. She glanced past me toward the bistro table. "That thing has been bothering me all week." "The table?" "You have 2 chairs and somehow still made it look like furniture for one person." I laughed. "What do you want to do with it?" "Put it in the middle." We each took one side. The wrought iron was heavier than it looked. I carried it down my porch steps while she backed carefully across the grass. We set it halfway between the 2 cabins. Colleen stepped back, narrowed her eyes, then pushed her side a few inches. "Now it's in the middle." It was already in the middle. It was closer to yours. I nudged it an inch toward her cabin. "There." She smiled. "Better." We set the 2 chairs facing each other. Then Colleen took her phone from her pocket. "I'm calling Brooke," she said. "She should hear it from me." I nodded and went back inside. I didn't stand nearby to listen. Friday morning, the utility crew arrived at 7:30. The diesel truck came up the drive towing a flatbed. 2 men got out, spoke with Colleen beside the pink cabin, and started unloading steel anchors and conduit. No towing cables, no skids, no question left for me to answer. I carried 2 coffees out to the bistro table in the middle of the clearing. Colleen joined me a few minutes later, rubbing her hands together against the cold. Behind her, the crew started the work that would make moving the cabin much harder and much more expensive. "You okay?" she asked. "I am now." She looked at the men setting the first anchor, then back at me. "Good." That evening, I drove us into Viroqua for the date I had asked for. I chose a small place in town where I knew nobody in the kitchen and had no reason to inspect the line. I still noticed the host stand, the table spacing, and how long it took our drinks to arrive. Then I caught myself doing it and stopped. Colleen noticed anyway. "You're working," she said. "A little." "So am I." She had been watching a server carry 4 plates with one arm. Our eyes met across the table. She gave me a small, caught-you-off-guard smile, and I shook my head once before we both looked down at our menus. After that, we made an effort. We talked about things that had no operational value. The first car she had driven until rust opened a hole near the passenger floorboard. The summer I worked a county fair food stand because I thought it would be easy money. The 3 years her cabin kit had waited before she found a place she wanted to put it. The book in my cabin I had carried back and forth for 3 trips without reading. At one point, my phone vibrated in my jacket. I didn't reach for it. A few seconds later, hers vibrated in her bag. She didn't reach for hers either. Neither phone rang a second time. When dinner was over, we walked 1 block before getting into the car. The air was cold enough that our breath showed. Colleen slipped her hand into mine without announcing it. I thought about how I had arrived earlier that week, gripping a suitcase, and calculating how quickly I could reclaim my privacy. Now I was already thinking about the next weekend I could come back. That change scared me less than I expected. 5 weeks later, I drove back up the dirt road to the Driftless region. In the weeks between, we hadn't tried to turn each other into another full-time obligation. We called a few nights a week after our kitchens closed, usually for 10 or 15 minutes. Most of those calls had nothing to do with staffing, sales, or repairs. I finished the book I had ignored for 3 years. She told me when she finally found curtains she could tolerate. Once, I moved a vendor call because it overlapped with the time we had agreed to talk, and I didn't feel guilty about it. I hadn't waited a year. I hadn't waited until I was so burned out I couldn't see straight. I had put this weekend on the restaurant's master calendar a month in advance. Timothy was running the floor, and the building hadn't burned down. I pulled my suitcase out of the trunk and walked toward the clearing. The pink cabin was finished, the porch light shining brightly in the dusk. My log cabin stood quiet and sturdy on the left. We hadn't moved in together. We hadn't erased our separate spaces. Colleen was standing by the pink cabin, touching up a tiny spot of trim on the doorframe with a small brush. She heard the gravel crunch and turned around. She didn't look surprised this time. She just smiled, wiped the brush, and walked out to the middle of the clearing. Between our two houses, the bistro table waited. "So," I said, stopping beside the table with my suitcase, "where are we sitting tonight?" "You picked the restaurant in town last time," Colleen said, her eyes bright with a quiet, fierce joy. "Tonight, I'm hosting. You're on my porch." I rolled my suitcase to the foot of her porch and set it beside the bottom step before following her up. I wasn't just coming to the woods to disappear anymore. I was coming back to her.